The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered via certified mail with that official green card that always signals a looming disaster. I was still in my pajamas, the steam from my coffee rising into the quiet morning air, when I tore open the envelope. And quote, "Dear Miss Chun," and quote, it began, in that cold, corporate font that seems designed to intimidate. And quote, "This correspondence serves as official notice that the property located at Blackwood Lane is in violation of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association covenants, codes, and restrictions," and quote. I had to read it 3 times before the words truly penetrated my disbelief. They were giving me 30 days. 30 days to comply. 30 days to tear down my grandfather's barn. 30 days to remove what they called and quote, unsightly agricultural structures and quote, and restore the property to their and quote, residential standards and quote, or I would face daily fines of $500. My hands shook as I set the letter down on the kitchen table. The barn wasn't just some random, decaying structure. It was the heart of this land. It was where my grandfather had kept his workshop for over 40 years. It was where he taught me how to use a lathe when I was only 7 years old, and where we spent countless summers hand restoring a 1967 Mustang. It was the last piece of him I had left, and these people, neighbors I barely knew, wanted it gone because it didn't match their perfect, beige aesthetic. I grabbed my phone and called Tom Bradford, the only attorney I trusted in this town and a man who had known my grandfather since the 50s. I told him they were trying to demolish the barn, and for a moment, the line went silent. Then, Tom's voice came through, cautious and strangely focused. He asked me if I had looked at the full survey of the land recently. I told him no, I had only inherited the homestead 6 months ago and was still sorting through the boxes. He told me to gather every piece of paperwork my grandfather had left regarding the land and meet him at his office immediately. 3 hours later, I sat in Tom's office. The room smelled of old dust and aged parchment. Tom spread a large, yellowed survey map across his desk, his finger tracing a thick, bold red boundary line. He looked at me and said, and quote, "Sarah, your grandfather owned 1,000 acres, and quote." I stared at him, confused, because I thought the development had taken most of it. But then he pulled out a more recent map, one showing the Meadowbrook Estates development with its neat rows of houses, the clubhouse, and the community pool. He told me that in 1998, my grandfather sold 200 acres to a developer, but the deed included a very specific reversion clause. The developer was legally required to maintain a 50-foot buffer zone around the original homestead. If they violated those terms, the land would legally revert back to my grandfather's estate. Tom pointed to the survey with a grim smile. The developers had gotten greedy. They had built 3 houses, numbers 34, 35, and 36, directly inside that buffer zone. Legally, the moment they poured that concrete, they breached the contract. That meant that back in 2003, those 200 acres, including the ground under the HOA clubhouse and hundreds of homes, legally reverted to my grandfather. He never pursued it because he was getting older and didn't want the stress of a fight. But I had inherited everything. The HOA didn't have authority over me. I actually had total authority over them. The emergency HOA meeting was called for Saturday morning. I walked into the clubhouse at 10 o'clock sharp, with Tom by my side carrying a leather portfolio that held the fate of 247 families. The board sat at a long table on a raised platform, looking like a suburban tribunal. Patricia Hendris, the HOA president, sat in the middle. Her hair sprayed into stiff perfection and her smile as sharp as a razor. She thanked me for joining them, her voice dripping with false courtesy, and said they were there to discuss my disregard for community standards. I didn't sit down. I set my portfolio on the table and looked her directly in the eyes. I told her that we weren't there to discuss my barn, but rather their illegal occupation of my land. The room went so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Tom stepped forward and began laying out the surveys and the original deeds. He explained the reversion clause and showed them the evidence that they were sitting on property they no longer legally owned. Patricia's face went from a tan glow to a deep, panicked crimson. She tried to claim they had deeds, but Tom calmly reminded her that their deeds were issued by a developer who had lost the right to the land 20 years ago. I told them I was willing to resolve this, but on my terms. I gave them 24 hours. I told them they had 1 day to re-sign the violation notice, issue a formal apology, and amend their covenants to permanently exclude my homestead from any and all HOA restrictions forever. I told them if they didn't, I would invoke my rights as the true landowner. I told them I could dissolve their association entirely, or I could simply start charging fair market ground rent for every square foot they were occupying. Tom had already calculated the rent for the community pool alone at $15,000 a month. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, some were crying, and others were calling their own lawyers on the spot. Patricia was shrieking that I couldn't do this, but I just looked at her and said that I could, and I would. And quote, you gave me 30 days. And quote, I told her. And quote, but I'm only giving you 24 hours. And quote, then I walked out. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my porch, looking at the barn in the moonlight, waiting for the world to come crashing down. But at 9:47 the next morning, my email pinged. It was a formal letter from the board. They had surrendered. They rescinded the notice, they apologized for the distress, and they legally changed their rules to ensure my property would never be bothered again. They were terrified of losing their homes, and they finally realized they had picked a fight with the wrong person. I walked out to the barn with a fresh cup of coffee and ran my hand along the weathered wood. I looked at the old Mustang waiting for me inside and smiled. I decided right then that I was going to restore that car, and maybe I'd build a few more unsightly structures just for the fun of it. I have 1,000 acres, after all, and I plan to use every inch of them. My grandfather didn't just leave me land, he left me the power to stand my ground. Sometimes, the best way to handle a bully is to show them exactly who owns the ground they're standing on. It's a reminder that history and heritage are worth fighting for, no matter how much and beige and the world tries to paint over it. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly appreciate you taking the time to watch the full story. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and revenge, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you again for your support, and thank you for watching until the very end. Your text here to convert text to speech now.